For more on this, we're now joined by Tshepo Sefotlhelo, who's from the Gender-Based Violence Response Fund. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. That story that we've just played, very disturbing. I wonder, even before we dive into this conversation, is what we're seeing in our schools a reflection of society at large, and that our children are learning from society how to behave or misbehave in schools?
Peter, thank you very much. And I think, the question that you've asked is such a pertinent question, right? Because, if you look at South Africa's unfortunate history, violence has been part of that history, and that violence continues. And children, it's learned behavior, right? Because a child is like a sponge. Children do not do as you say, but they do as you do. So often what we see, if a child grows up in a violent area, violent neighborhood, or violent home, chances are they will use violence wherever it is that they go. And I think, yes, that what we are seeing at our schools now, where kids are being violent, where some of the kids are even raping their peers, or molesting their peers, or just killing or stabbing one another, it's actually learned behavior, right? And it's a reflection of society. If you look at what's happening in broader South African issues of crime or violent crime, crime is all over the world, right? But South African crime is quite violent, right? And you see that happening in society, and you see that the kids are picking this up, and it's happening in our schools, and it's quite unfortunate. And if you have a look at the numbers that are happening, and I mean, just last week there was a video circulating on social media where a boy starts hitting a girl who was just sitting down, and starts really hitting her, and really just being very physical and violent with that girl. And what happens in that scenario? Nobody's doing anything. If anything, the closest thing that anybody came to doing anything was taking a video. So it just shows you that as South Africans, this has been normalized. We see nothing wrong with it. Even when somebody's being robbed in the center of town, you always see people just walking by. All the action that people take is to take a video. And it's quite unfortunate, really.
How do we respond to this? Because clearly there's a lot of psychological trauma that's taken place leading up to this violence.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that point, right, Peter? Because even if you look in our history, right, there's always talk about reparations, and talk about BE, the political freedom, economic freedom, and all of that. But nobody has really ever spoken about the psyche, the emotional damage, and the mental damage that the past has caused, particularly to the majority of this country, right? And we've just carried on and spoken about, how do we make up for the economic exclusion, the political exclusion, but the issues of the damage that it has done, the psychological damage that it has done. Because remember, most of our fathers were abused, because apartheid was a form and an abuse to a particular grouping of people, right? So you find that frustration and that violence has been passed on from one generation to the other, right? And if you have a look, it's yes, violence and bullying is happening across South Africa and across South African schools, but you see that the violence that is happening, it's more and it's higher in schools in previously black areas, in townships, in disadvantaged areas. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but absolutely the psychological impact of kids that are growing up in violent homes, but also the psychological damage of those that have lived this violent past. It's something that we really need to address. So it's really the system that needs to be geared from giving the kind of mental health that is required to deal with our society.
Talking about the system, what needs to change in our education system to get greater protection, particularly for our girl children who are being abused by adult teachers?
Yeah. So what happened last year, and I really must commend the Department of Basic Education, where they came out and said, if a minor at school, a young girl, is pregnant, then automatically who that father is, they're going to be prosecuted and they're going to be arrested, right? So I think that's a step in the right direction. But over and above that, what we need to make sure is that once we've said that, we need to make sure that the implementation of that rule, it's actually managed 100%, so that indeed that teacher. And also what needs to happen is when a teacher has been found to have impregnated a child or raped a child or molested a child, that teacher should not be able to teach ever again, because sometimes you find that a teacher has been found wanting in this regard, but they simply leave the school and they go to another school. I mean, a couple of years back, there's a polo coach who was caught in Australia doing molesting children in Australia, and only to find out that in South Africa they were doing this as well. So they've got a history. So how that person got to Australia to get a teaching job is really unacceptable, right? And these are the things that we need to do. But also from a systematic perspective, we got to create an environment where a child feels safe to tell somebody when something has happened. Often what happens is when a child wants to report something like this, they feel scared, they feel ashamed, right? And all around, they don't have an environment where they say, oh, I can go to my dad, I can go to an uncle, or I can even tell somebody else at school. Often what happens when any form of abuse, whether it's at the school, whether it's the victim is a child, or even it's happening in the workplace, unfortunately, the first point of call is, let's keep it quiet. Let's manage it ourselves. We don't want to embarrass the family. We don't want to embarrass the company, or whatever the case might be. So I think, first of all, we need to create a safe environment for our children to be able to tell us when something is wrong. But also, once the child has reported this and a case has been opened, then the police then come in. Then they also need to be geared to investigate, to make sure that they manage this case very well, and make sure that a conviction is seen and then justice is served. So it's about a system that needs to work. It's about the support that we have for our kids from a psychological and an emotional perspective. But also the system in terms of the law enforcement, it needs to be on par with that. So it's not enough for us to speak about zero tolerance, but in our action, it also has to say zero tolerance.
All right, and protection is one layer. I guess also education, because particularly the younger girls, they get groomed, don't they, by these older men who are quite crafty. And so that the children sometimes don't know that what's happening is wrong and don't know to report it. I suppose this is another layer that we really need to put attention to, is educating and showing these young girls what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And the education doesn't only need to happen to the child, right? But it also needs to happen to adults as well, because me as a teacher or as a father, I need to be able to spot when something has happened to my child, because sometimes it takes us to see that there's something wrong. And there's learned behavior from if I'm a teacher or from an adult, I can go through such training to spot a child when they're going through something like this. But also, unfortunately, we've got grown men who take advantage of children, because that children, for example, may come from a disadvantaged background. So maybe they apply them with money, or it's an issue, if you want to improve your grade. And it's something that we need to look out for. But I think the most important thing, Peter, is that if we start really throwing the book at people who start doing this type of thing, then it will create an environment where people can see that it's not easy to get away with something like this. But also from an educational perspective, we need to start having our kids tough conversation with our children earlier on, to say, look, if somebody touches you in such a way, you have to tell them no, and you have to tell someone. I think for ourselves, we started having this type of conversation with our daughter when she was 8 years old, right? And it's always a constant reminder to say what is appropriate, what is inappropriate for somebody to say. And whenever you hear something like that, do not be afraid to come to us and tell us, and we will make sure that we manage it in a safe manner. And the most important thing is, even when your child comes to that, the first thing, particularly as a father, right, you're protective. So the first thing that comes up is you get very angry, you start seeing, and that can scare a child, right? So I think it's very important that we start having conversations with our kids earlier on, and we need to start being open in society about talking about these type of things, because it's always a taboo subject. Oh, no, you can't speak about that with kids, or we can't speak this about the church. But it's something that we really need to start speak to, because if you think of all the socioeconomic challenges that are plaguing our society, whether it be jobs, poverty, food security. We talk about it on a daily basis and regularly. And so is this issue of violence and sexual violence towards our children, towards our women. It's something as a society we need to start talking about more and more, because it is really an issue that our children are grappling with and our women are grappling with, and it's unfortunate.
Tshepo, we're going to have to leave it there, but I think a conversation that we need to have more often. But thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. All right, that's Tshepo Sefotlhelo, who's with Gender-Based Violence Response Fund, talking to us particularly about the concerns of violence towards children in schools that seems to be on the rise at the moment.